So a teacher wanted his students to learn all about the stories of the town in which they lived. So he brought them to a local nursing home, and they wheeled out an older gentleman and an older woman who were sitting in their wheelchairs, and they began telling stories about the town that they grew up in. And finally, after about 45 minutes, the old man looked at the woman and said, "I think we ought to stop now. I think we're boring those kids." And she shot up in her chair. She said, "Nonsense. Nonsense." And she looked at all of them. "If at the end of your life you don't got any good stories, what do you got? At the end of this conference, you don't have any good stories, ask for your money back. It won't work, but we'll think about it." But the importance that what we have heard all throughout the conference is that people have told us their stories and then have showed us the data. They've showed us in terms of evidence-based research, but how does it connect with the hearts and minds of other people? The stories of servant leadership are what moves us. And I look over the audience. It was wonderful. All of you have had the opportunity to hear the stories of Dave Scogan and Festival. In fact, when we first began servant leadership, nobody knew what we were talking about. I said, well, they're practicing it at Festival Foods. And then other places began to understand, we can do this at Toro, where Mark works. Krista has spent a lifetime in the Fond du Lac community building up servant leadership by giving examples of how it works. Well, here in La Crosse, we're very fortunate. The Kwik Corporation has understood the power of servant leadership, and all of our lives have been enhanced because of it. Isn't it amazing, Glenn, in terms of the dairy at Kwik serving our farmers? And what was really interesting when the pandemic hit, who was giving out milk to schools who were trying to feed kids who didn't have lunches? I mean, it's just extraordinary. Those kinds of stories of who we really are reveal what we really value. Well, today, you're in for a treat. Two of the finest storytellers you're ever going to meet, John McHugh and Ryan Clark. John taught our daughters, and on a recent vacation said he was the highlight of our high school years. Not dances, not programs, John McHugh. Always loved going to his class. Understand this, if you can entertain and engage a sophomore in high school, you can talk to any CEO anywhere. And what does he do? He helps people to believe in themselves because of a greater good. And his colleague and friend and partner in the work, Ryan Clark. Ryan, Air Force veteran. Ryan comes back, starts working at Kwik Trip. John sees something in Ryan that he doesn't see himself, invites him into training and development, and Ryan then becomes part of the master's program in servant leadership. Ryan Clark then begins to understand his ability to serve because John McHugh saw it in him. Ryan becomes the chairperson for the veterans flights, Freedom Honor flights, gets involved. And in one class, Ryan has all of us write a note to a veteran, because when they're on the Freedom Honor flight, they call mail call. And all these young men, when they were 17 or 18, deploying overseas to the wars in Europe or Korea, this is what they looked for, was a letter from home. I mention this. Monday's July 4th. All of us know a veteran. Could each of us write a note to a veteran thanking them for their service, adding to the stories of those who serve and lead us each and every day? Please welcome John McHugh and Ryan Clark.
Thank you, Tom. Generous as always. I want to start with one of the most famous Kwik Trip stories that we tell internally. For those of you who've ever heard me speak, I've told it many times externally. But it's part of our story culture here in our company. Some time ago, we had one of our store leaders out at the pumps changing out the garbage when one of our elderly guests pulled up. Internally, we don't refer to people as customers, we call them guests. It was an elderly guy. Saw that she worked at Kwik Trip because she had the blue shirt on, and said, "Hey, I see you work here. How do I put gas in my car?" And as soon as he asked that, she thought maybe he was having some memory issues. So she said, well, it's a pretty simple process, and she helped him dispense about 10 gallons of fuel. When they were done, he said, hang on, I have a second question. How do I know if I need oil in my engine? And she said, well, it's pretty simple as well. Let me show you. So she went to the driver's side and found the latch for the hood and popped it open. They went to the front of the car, and she said, so we're going to put this rod in place so that the hood doesn't come back and hit you on the noggin. And I know this looks pretty confusing in here. There's a lot of different parts, but we're going to look for a part. They have a funny term for it. They call it a dipstick. She grabbed some paper towel from the dispenser and wiped off the dipstick and said, "Sir, can you see the little line that's etched in this metal stick?" And he bent his glasses over and he said, "Yeah, I can see that line." "Well, we're going to put this stick back in, and the black smudge has to come up to that line." They checked his oil. It was perfect. She said, "Sir, next time when you do this on your own, if the smudge is below the line, that means you need oil. You come into the store, and one of our coworkers will find out what kind of oil you need for your engine and where it goes inside here, but today it looks like you're good to go." She was just about to walk away, and he said, No, third question. How do I know if I need air in my tires?" She said, "It's a pretty simple process as well. You pull over to the side of the lot. We have an air compressor, and I'll show you how to use that." He pulled his car over, and again, she opened up the driver's side door, and she said, "Sir, there's this white tag here, and I know it's got a lot of numbers on the outside. It looks pretty confusing, but we're going to look for a number right before an abbreviation, PSI. And that means pounds per square inch. And that's the number we're going to tap into this little machine called an air compressor." They checked all 4 tires. They were perfectly fine. And he stood up, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I know how to pump my own gas. I've always pumped my own gas. Secondly, I know how to check the oil in my engine. Matter of fact, I don't even take my car to a mechanic to have the oil changed. I change my own oil. I know how to do this. Thirdly, I've never had a tire go down because of a lack of air pressure. I know how to check the air in my tires." But he said, "I came here today to Kwik Trip to see if what they say about you is true. I heard that you take care of people." He said, "I'm glad to know that it's true, that you do take care of people. Because I found out this week that I have terminal cancer. In 3 months, I won't be here. My wife and I have been married 53 years. She's never had a pump." My wife and... Okay. Do I just use teacher voice? Would that work? Okay. "My wife and I have been married 53 years, and she's never had to pump gas. She's never had to check the oil in our engine. She has no clue how to put air in our tires. And I'm afraid that after I'm gone, she won't know how to do that. So I want to make sure that there's some place where she can come after I'm gone, that they'll take care of her." He said, "I'm glad to know what they say about you is true, that you take care of people." She's since passed away, and she shows up at our store every week in Fairmont, Minnesota, and our coworkers pump the gas for her. And as you well know, we are not a full-service gas station. They check the oil in her engine and remind her of how well her husband used to take care of her. They check all 4 tires for air. When Deanna told me the story, I said, "Deanna, why did you do it?" She said, "John, you know exactly why I did it. It's our mission here at Kwik Trip. Our mission at Kwik Trip, believe it or not, is not to sell gasoline and hot dogs. We believe what Michael talked about this morning, that we have to have a purpose. And that purpose has to be greater than just selling stuff to people. Because at the end of the day, that's what our 34,000 coworkers want. They want to know that something they did today made a difference in someone's life. It's more important than selling gasoline and hot dogs. Now, we're blessed, as we talked about many times, is when you have a servant leadership culture, it has to start from the top. And we're blessed at Kwik Trip that we have it from the top. Our owner and CEO, Don Zitlow, 87 years old, still as bright as a tat, sharp as ever, in the office every single day. He's the perfect embodiment of what servant leadership is. And why? Here's our foundational story. It starts back in the 1950s when he and Levon were married. He worked on his father-in-law's farm for $125 a week. It was enough to kind of pay the bills until they had their first daughter. And then they couldn't make it anymore financially. So Don got a job driving as a truck driver for Robinson Transfer, a company that still exists here in La Crosse. Doubled his salary. And he only had to work now 5.5 days a week instead of 7 days a week on the farm. He said, "I died and I went to heaven." It was phenomenal. He said, sometimes after a couple of years, what you thought was a gift starts to become ordinary. And one morning, he started his route at 4 in the morning to deliver groceries from here in La Crosse to Hoka, Caledonia, different parts of southern Minnesota. When the truck was empty, he had to drive all the way to Hormel in Austin, Minnesota, pick up a load of meat. Came back to La Crosse about 9 o'clock at night and now had to offload himself thousands of pounds of meat. He was feeling sorry for himself. He said, I sat down on a load of meat, and frankly, in his own words, I started bitching. He said, I'm working my tail off this many hours a day to line the pockets of some rich CEO someplace. So, sitting on that load of meat, he made a commitment to himself. He said, if I'm ever a CEO and owner of a company, I'll make sure that the people that actually do the work get the profits. 30 years later, in 1989, he and John Hanson became sole owners of Kwik. And that was the first year which he carried through on that commitment he had made 30 years earlier. He started 40% profit sharing with all the coworkers at Kwik. 40% of pre-tax profits. Then we think, well, that's not so great. That means he's still getting 60%. He's still the rich CEO. Well, here's the reality, folks. 27.5% of our profits go to Uncle Sam to pay tax. 27.5% go to build new stores. 40% comes back to all of us. For those of you who are math wizards in the room, how much do we have left? Great, 5%. And that's what goes to Don and LeBon, second generation, the third generation, now the fourth generation. In his role as CEO since 1989, he's never taken a raise. And his goal, he said, is to die broke. Give it back to all the people that actually do the work. But here's the catch at Kwik. Not only do we receive generous profits, and he's a great servant leader in that respect, we believe that his role as servant leader isn't simply about just giving us money. It's about treating each of us individually and personally with compassion. With that in mind, Ryan, you have a story.
That's mine.
You have a better teacher voice than I do.
Well, I don't have a teacher voice, but I was a crew chief in the Air Force on the C-5 Galaxy, so a 4-engine cargo jet, and I can be louder than that. This happened to me a little over 5 years ago. I was outside working in my yard, and I come in, sit down on the couch, and immediately feel like something is wrong. My heart feels weird, it's racing. I've never had an experience like that before, and my wife can tell something is off. So she walks over and, quite honestly, has a little bit of skepticism because of how I act when I'm sick or injured. I knew someone would say it. But she puts her hand on my chest, and for just one brief second, her eyes betrayed that there was something wrong. You could tell that she felt it too. And she looks at me and she says, "What do you need?" And I said, "I think we have to go to the hospital." I have no idea what's going on. I don't have a history of heart problems at all. So we pile up the family in the car. She drives. I'm holding my hand on my chest just in case something stops. We get to the clinic in Onalaska. I walk in and I learned that day that if you say heart at the receptionist, they have a big red button that they push. And there are a bunch of people available suddenly. So my family's in the waiting room. They shuffle me back. They throw me in a room. Somebody tosses 2 aspirin in my mouth and says, "Chew." I've got my shirt coming off. They're hooking up wires and probes and all of that as they try to determine what's wrong with me, because they can sense it too. Well, a little bit about my family. At the time, my oldest daughter was 5 years old, and my youngest daughter was 3 months. My wife had just returned from maternity leave. I remember them telling me, "Your family's going to come back." And I see my 5-year-old walk through that door, and she sees Dad with his shirt off, all of these wires going to my chest, and just this look of panic on her face. Heartbroken. Best I could do on a moment's notice, I turned to her and I said, "Look, they're trying to turn Dad into a robot." She smiled. We were together. Well, after just a couple of minutes, the readouts are reading that I have atrial fibrillation, which is very common. in people that are about 30 or 40 years older than me at the time. Not so common in somebody my age. At first, they're telling me I'm just going to sit, we're going to see if I come out of it naturally. And after probably about a half an hour, it seemed, in that waiting room, they said, nope, we're going to send you down to the hospital. We'll see if you come out of it down there. They offered me an ambulance. I said no. If you tell people at the hospital, no, I don't want an ambulance, that's in your permanent medical record. I didn't want my daughters to see me getting loaded in an ambulance, right? That's where seriously injured people go. Dad's fine, he's talking, walk around. So we head down to the hospital, and they admit me, and we stay for a little while, and at that point it's just observation. We're just gonna keep everything hooked up. If you come out of it naturally, that's fine. Well, at this point, my wife has to get home. The girls have to be fed. So she leaves, promises to call me later. I'm like, no, you're a good mom, be a good mom. And she leaves. Shortly after she leaves, the doctors come in, and they tell me what phase 2 is for AFib if you don't come out of it naturally. They're going to stop and restart my heart, is how they describe it. So here I am, 39 years old at the time, brand new baby that I'm just getting to know, 5-year-old, being told that somebody is going to stop my heart on purpose. The next day I wake up, I am still in AFib, everything's going to happen that day. Treatment works. My wife was there when I went to sleep. My wife was there when I woke up the next day. But she still has to be a parent in addition to just a worried wife. Well, here's the point in the story where I become a supporting actor in my own story. After I was in recovery, my wife comes back to the hospital and she tells me, I had a guest today. Who was your guest? Our CEO and president, Don Zitlow, stopped by her office to find out how I was doing. Now, she's not a vice president. She's not a director at Kwik, neither am I. She's got a handful of direct reports. They've met a couple of times, but he knew her, he knew me, and he knew that I was in trouble. And he says, Teresa, what do you need? And she goes, nothing, we're fine. He goes, you have a 5-year-old at home. You're just back from maternity leave. Your husband is in the hospital. What do you need? How many people do that? How many people make the effort to stop by an office to check on somebody like that?
Don, for us, is a perfect example that it's not simply about sharing the profits, but really showing us individual compassion. It's amazing when he goes to our corporate office how many times he'll stop you and he'll ask about your spouse by name, your kids by name, and also remind you you haven't taken a vacation in a while. Go. It's compassion. But for us, although we don't use the specific term of servant leadership at Kwik, that's very much part of our culture. But one of the things we want to work with all of our leaders and up-and-coming leaders is that they make servant leadership their own style. We don't want them simply to become another Don or to lead the way that Don does, because very few of us can emulate his style. So we spend a lot of time with our individuals finding out what is their path, what is their niche, and how can we help them become a servant leader. Ryan is a good example. It's all yours.
A few years later, my wife and I have a ritual when we get home from work. We both work for Kwik. We know all the same folks. So we come home and we sit around the island in the kitchen and we ask how your day was. Oh, it was good. Oh, this happened. How was your day? Oh, it was good. But one day, it was further back than that. It was probably about 10 years ago now. My wife comes home and she goes, I want to get an MBA. First question I asked, what's an MBA? I didn't think she was tall enough. So she explains what an MBA is. She had seen that Viterbo had an MBA program and she figured this could help her at work. Well, she had done her undergrad University of Wisconsin Stout long before we had met, and this was her next path. So I, being the supportive husband I always am, said, I'm going to get an MBA too. And she said, no, you're not. Apparently, you can't skip from didn't finish college to master's program. There are no cheat codes. Now, there's a difference between didn't finish college and what I did. Didn't finish college for some people means that they found their path in life and then they pursued it. I did fine as a traditional student my first 2 semesters. My 3rd semester as a traditional student, I received a letter asking me not to return. The way I remember it, my semester GPA that semester was 0.45.
Right, you're one of the smartest guys I know. How do you get a .45 for a GPA?
I think it's a 5-credit D and 3 or 4 credit Fs.
Okay.
The math folks out here are doing the math in their head. No, he had a .38 or something. Not only that, but after appealing the decision the right way, saying, nope, this is totally my fault, I needed to meet a certain cumulative GPA. Even putting in as much effort as I possibly could, they kicked me out the next semester too. So didn't finish college for me was a little bit more difficult. But inspired by my wife, I decided I was going back to school. I learned that Western, here in La Crosse, had an agreement with Viterbo where I could do 2 years at Western, and then I could move that into a business class here to get my undergrad at Viterbo. All right. So my wife is doing her MBA, I'm doing my undergrad, and at some point during my undergrad, I do what I do best, which is just drop into John's office completely unannounced, sit in his chair and ask for advice. I kick up my feet and I said, I'm going to go back to school and get my MBA. And John thinks about it for a little while, and then he asks a question which was probably transformational for some of you in the room, all of us in the room. Have you met Tom Thibodeau? The rest of the conversation with John was geared towards servant leadership. I think about my role. At the time, I was the head of the training department at Kwik Trip. I'm doing budgets, I'm doing scheduling, I'm doing all of that work. But at the same time, we need to be talking about leadership. And if I take a class in servant leadership, I can incorporate that into what we talk about work. I can help build servant leaders. I can help talk about why those folks are drawn to servant leadership. I can share my own stories. So I get accepted in the class. I remember the interview process with Tom, and I think it was Matthew at the time, was mostly just storytelling back and forth. It was the easiest interview I ever had. I remember sitting there getting accepted in the program and then just being blown away by what that experience was like. You're constantly surrounded on Friday evenings and all day Saturday with good people that want to do good work in the community. You're inspired by their passion, and it's contagious. I've been asked by a couple of people, what was the program like? And I tell them it's like a warm hug that goes on for a day and a half. I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. Well, the story doesn't end with getting a master's degree in servant leadership, because now I have to apply this. I have to take it into the classroom. And one of the classes that I worked on was the last class that our new leaders get before we send them out into the world. And it's called servant leadership. We talk about some of those foundation principles. And we share our stories of what this means to us. What we don't need at Kwik Trip is a bad leader that's good at the bookwork. You can delegate the bookwork. You've got time to learn the bookwork. Our coworkers would rather have a good leader who's bad at the bookwork. We talk about compassion. And we share our examples of when other leaders were compassionate with us to make it okay to be compassionate to others. Example I share in class. I was fresh out of the military. I was working at the store trying to establish myself back in the lacrosse community. And I get a phone call at work that I was not looking forward to getting. Now, for those of you in the room that are parents, you know that you can't say out loud that you have a favorite kid. You do. But when you're a kid, you can say you have a favorite uncle or aunt, right? You can say that. And growing up, my favorite uncle and aunt, they lived in upstate New York, my ancestral homeland out there. And they did something every year. Every year, they would drive from roughly Rochester, New York, to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, for the EAA fly-in. At the EAA fly-in, they would enjoy themselves, but they would also pick up calendars and posters and VHS tapes. You might have to turn to the person next to you and tell them what VHS is. And then they would drive to La Crosse, where they would load me up with stuff. There's no question I was headed to the Air Force if you saw my bedroom walls when I was growing up. Nothing but planes all over the place. And I loved them for it. They were great. My uncle was the uncle that called you young man and treated you like an adult when you were 10 years old. They would drive to Rochester, Minnesota, where they had family, and then they would go home. And that was their yearly ritual. Well, once I got out of the military, it was my turn to return the favor to them. So we would fly out and visit them. We'd always stay at their house. And my Aunt Carol had a tradition that we started just then. She and I were the first two people up. So she would make coffee in the morning, and then we would sit in the kitchen and drink coffee. And I remember it clearly because in the grinds, she would throw 3 beans of hazelnut just to grind into it, just so there was a little hint of hazelnut in the coffee. And we would talk about whatever was on our minds. Well, first year. The second year, we're continuing our coffee tradition. But this time when she's pouring the coffee, I notice that there's a slight tremor in her hand. So I catch my uncle later that day, take him off to the side. I said, "Tremor?" "Yeah. We think it's Parkinson's. Don't say anything to your aunt. She knows, but let's not talk about it." "Okay." I think it was a year or two later before I was able to go back out. And when I visited her again, she needed help to walk from one room to the other. Now, this is faster than my understanding of how that disease is supposed to progress. So after we left, they went down to New York City, where she was seen by the doctor that treats Michael J. Fox for his Parkinson's. And he runs tests with his team, and they make a determination. They tell her, "I have good news for you and I have bad news for you. The good news is you do not have Parkinson's disease. The bad news is it appears you're having 1,000 tiny strokes every single day. They're killing your brain, and you do not have long to live." Devastating. So let's fast forward back to the store. Here I am, fresh out of the military, trying to establish myself back in the community. My dad calls me and says, "Aunt Carol's passed away." And I'm in the back of the store by the mop sink, bawling my eyes out. My store leader comes back. She knows me well enough to know that this is not usual behavior for Ryan. She says, "Ryan, it happened." And everybody says the same thing. They look up, and they go, "This is stupid, but..." And I get through the story about the air show and the posters and the calendar and the coffee and the hazelnut. And she goes, "Ryan, what do you need?" And everybody says the same thing. They say, "I don't know." Because you don't know. She said, "Ryan, should you be here right now?" Now, the store I worked at was very small. If I'm gone that evening, they're immediately short-staffed. I said, "I don't know." She said, "Ryan, go be with your family." I left. "What do you need?" Little acts of compassion. That's what we need to do.
In terms of our culture, compassion.
Try, okay, finally, okay, thank you. In terms of that culture of compassion, we believe that goodness celebrated creates more goodness. So back in 2004 at Kwik Trip, when we first started what we call our cultural revolution, that year we received 21 unsolicited guest compliment letters, where 21 people walked into the Kwik Trip office and said, I had a great experience at Kwik Trip. And I said to Don, what do you do with the letters after you read them? Because Don reads every single guest letter we get. He said, well, I put them in a file cabinet. And I said, well, how about if we do this? Every time we get the letter, we'll publish it in our Wednesday newsletter to all the stores. And if we know who the coworkers, we'll send them a little gift card and thank them for what they've done. Because goodness celebrated creates more goodness. Those 21 letters in 2004, this last year has now translated into 2,529 unsolicited guest compliment letters this last year. And so if you ever stop at a Kwik Trip store on Wednesday and you see a bunch of coworkers reading a paper newsletter, and you notice that they're teary-eyed and they're crying, it's because sometimes there's not a dry eye in the store because you realize the beautiful things that our coworkers do. Well, here's the catch. It's also a reason why at Kwik Trip we're a story-driven culture. We believe that we learn best through stories. You know, there's different parts of your brain. There's your cerebral cortex that remembers things like physics and theory and mathematics. The problem is it doesn't remember that information for very long. There's another part of your brain called the limbic brain, close to where your stem comes in, and that's the part of your brain that remembers stories and stories with an emotional content. And if I can touch your limbic brain, you'll remember that lesson 12 to 15 times longer than anything in your cerebral cortex. So if we want to influence culture, and we want to make sure everyone that lives a life of compassion at the store, we tell stories of compassion. That compassionate stories told begets more compassionate stories. Here's one of my favorite ones. I used it because this morning Tom used that wonderful line, kids these days. Quote, I'm a regular customer at your Sheboygan store. In the past, my family causes this store a lot of problems because my son constantly steals from them. It's not a good situation in our environment. Your staff has always treated me with compassion, even though my child has done this. On a side note, my family and I do not have much. My son went to the store on Saturday in February, and he had no socks on because we just don't have money right now for new ones. It was snowing pretty badly, and one of your staff members was outside shoveling. My son was sitting on the curb cleaning the snow out of his shoes. Your staff member, Matt, came up to my son and asked if he was okay. He helped my son clean the snow out of his shoes, and then gave my son his own socks off his feet. Matt also told my son that if he ever needed anything, just to come and ask. Boy, it gives a whole new meaning to giving someone the shirt off your back. Your staff continues to show compassion to me, even after my child's mistakes that cost them time and money. Thank you for hiring caring people. When we got the letter, I contacted Jessica, the store leader. I said, hey, we got a really neat letter about one of your coworkers. Did you know anything about it? And this is what Jess emailed back. John, I was working when this happened. The coworker came back to me after he did this. He sat down in my office and he cried because he felt so badly for that kid. I was very proud of my coworker. His name is Matt. He's 18 years old and still in high school. Tom said, kids these days. Well, I contacted Matt. I said, Matt, why did you do it? He said, well, because you all told me in my first day in the job that the most important thing I was supposed to do was not sell gasoline and hot dogs. You told me that the mission here at Kwik Trip was to treat others as you'd like to be treated. That's how I was raised. If I didn't have socks, I'd hope somebody else would give them if they had them. I was just doing what you asked me to do. Well, you know, kudos to his mom and dad. Matter of fact, I told this story at a keynote in Appleton. I had Matt, his mom and dad, his grandma and grandpa there. I said, thank you for raising your son the way you did. And because you know what? If they didn't raise him the way, there's nothing that we could do at Kwik Trip to change that. Because as phenomenal as our training program is, if you're bad to the bone, there ain't a darn thing we can do in a training program to fix that. So for us at Kwik Trip, it's not about the training, it's about the hiring. And so here are the first three questions we ask every time we interview. Doesn't matter if you're making the donut here in La Crosse or delivering the donut or selling the donut. First question we ask you is, Tell me about the last random act of kindness you did for someone. What was the last random act of kindness you did for someone? Number 2, how have you treated others as you'd like to be treated in the last month? Do you actually know and live the golden rule? And thirdly, how have you made a difference in someone's life these last 6 weeks? And if you can't answer those first 3 questions, we don't go any further in the interview process. But if you do, we hire you and say, you know what? Your first day in the job, it's more important than just selling stuff to people. Live our mission. And I give you a challenge to go into any of our stores and say to one of our coworkers, what's your mission here at Kwik Trip? And you know what? All 34,000 will be able to tell you, just to treat others as you'd like to be treated, make a difference in someone's life. And the reason why they know it is because at every single meeting, at every single level in the company, that's how we start the meeting. Way back in 2004, we used to have to read it off a sheet. Now we all just recite it together. It sounds like you should say amen when you're done. But here's why we say it. Because unless we remind each other every day what's the most important purpose of our existence as individuals, as a company, we start to forget it. But when we tell those stories of compassion, compassion begets more compassion when you've hired compassionate people. Now the reality is for all of us here at Kwik Trip, that path can go in different directions. We talked about earlier this morning what happens sometimes when someone has an excellent experience in one role and we put them in another role, and maybe that's not exactly where they're supposed to be. At Kwik Trip, we don't simply believe in having a job. We believe in helping people find their vocation. And how we define vocation is that when your skills and your abilities and your passion meets the needs of the world. With that in mind, Ryan's got a story, a challenging story, about purpose, compassion, and his goal. I think it works.
We'll see if it works. Oh, there's my voice. About 2 years ago, we had just hired a couple of new folks in the department. John and I are meeting in my office, trying to decide how best to utilize those folks right away as they came into our company. And I'm overseeing the training department at the time. There's a lot going on. We're talking about those folks. And then John starts talking about a couple of new initiatives that we had. There was an opportunity to completely revamp our classes. And there was an opportunity to add a couple of new classroom topics, things that had been requested. We just didn't have the time to talk about them. Now, we talked earlier about this. Robert Greenleaf talks about listening as a servant leader. And John was listening that day. Because sitting there in my office, the more we talked about these new initiatives, the more engaged my body language was. I didn't say anything. I just sat and listened to him. And at one point, he stopped talking, and he leans in and he says, "You want to do this." I never asked for it. He just saw it in my body language. Now, truth be told, I did. Overseeing the training department, budgets, meetings about meetings. It was taking me away from the classroom. The more I spent managing the training department, the less time I spent with new leaders talking about what I felt was important. I missed being in the classroom. I missed sharing my journey with new folks. I missed answering their questions, learning new things, meeting new people. I just missed that classroom. Well, you want to do this is a very weighted question, because the unspoken question was, you know you can't do both. He never said it, but I knew that I wouldn't be able to work on these new projects and manage the department. Well, a career change like that is a family decision. So I went home and I talked to my wife, and she was immediately on board. She had woken up in the middle of the night and seen me on my work email on my phone, never responding, always reading. She had seen me pull out my phone and look at work email while my kids were swinging at the park. when I should be with them. And it wasn't fair. I missed the classroom. So I came in, talked to John, we made a change. Now, this was a really difficult discussion to have with him because he had never been critical of my leadership style. But I made the change. I've been with the company now for 19 years, 14 in the training department. Next year, Kwik Trip is going to give me a month off of work, paid, to celebrate my 20-year anniversary. And I don't have to dip in to my PTO to do any of that. My life has been better because of the culture at Kwik Trip. We take care of people, and we have leaders that take care of other people. We have leaders know that if you're passionate somewhere else, let's do that instead. My family's life has been better because mom and dad work at Kwik Trip. I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had. When I started with the company back in May of 2003, quite honestly, all I was looking for was a job. I just needed a job to pay the bills until I got back on my feet and found my real job. 19 years later, I found a vocation.
Last story.
Last story. Every year, as you can imagine, when we give out the profit sharing checks, because of the 41% profit sharing, Don and Levon receive just tons of mail, gratitude letters. Well, one day, late in December, Don walked into my office and there were tears in his eyes. And he handed me a note and he said, "You have to read this one." And in the letter, it was from one of our coworkers in the Madison market. He was a single father of 3 young girls. He wrote a note to Don. He said, "Don, I want to thank you for the fact this is my first year at Kwik Trip, and I was so impressed by the profit sharing. That year, all of us got a 12% cash bonus." He said, "With the money that you gave me at bonus time, I was able to buy for each one of my daughters their first beds. They had been sleeping on the floor in our apartment." And then each one of the girls had penned an individual letter to Don. And in their own handwriting, they said, "Dear Mr. Zietlow, thank you for the money that you gave my dad at Christmas. We love our beds. They are so comfortable." And Don, with tears in his eyes, held those up and he said, This is why we need to make more money. Not for myself, but for our coworkers, because they need it." Every single time Don Zietlow talks about our profit, his next line is always this: "This is how much money we might make this year, and 40% of that is," and he fills in the blank. He never once talks about profit for himself or for the sake of a large corporation. He talks about the fact we need 40% profit sharing because of all of our 34,000 coworkers. He wants it to be successful not for himself, but for all of us. When you have a leader like that, who says not only 40% profit sharing, but also at the end of every single talk he's ever given to the coworkers, in my 18 years there, his last line is always this, and all I can say is thank you. And all I can say is thank you. When you have a CEO of a corporation of $3.6 billion in sales, where his primary goal is for all of us, and all I can say is thank you, Kwik Trip for us is a great place to work. Thanks for being with us.
Remember Jervis saying that people aren't looking for a friendly place or a friendly church, people are looking for friends. These 2 men are good friends, and their work together has enhanced the lives of thousands and every one of our communities. One more time for John McHugh and Ryan Clark.